5 after 4, not bad. Welcome to the Chess Annual Lecture. My name is Julia Adams, and with Professor Isabel Amares in Political Science, I co-direct the Center for Historical Inquiry and the Social Sciences, otherwise known as CHESS. CHESS highlights and deals with the interplay between history and the present, and focuses both on new substantive, but also methodological thinking and scholarship around large-scale social change, social problems and solutions, and possible futures. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to express 2 sets of thanks on behalf of Isabel and myself. First to Chuck Weller, who is not able to be here with us today, but who has helped support the Chess Annual Lecture and who will be able to watch this recording. We are very grateful. And second to the Macmillan Center and its staff for inspiration and general support. Macmillan has always spanned disciplinary divides and inspired a diverse complement of scholars to pose big questions that help us better understand the world we live in. And speaking of just that, I'm delighted to introduce Jim Mahoney, Gordon Fulcher Professor of Decision Making, Professor of Sociology and Political Science at Northwestern, who will speak to us on the topic of causal analysis in social science history / historical social science, itself an interesting point of variability. Professor Mahoney is a comparative historical researcher with deep interests in political development, Latin America, and social science history method. He has written, co-written, and edited a slew of excellent and much awarded books, including most recently, The Logic of Social Science, Princeton University Press. His Colonialism and Postcolonial Development, Spanish America and Comparative Perspective received 6 major awards from sections in the ASA and APSA. His co-edited books with Kathleen Thelen and Gary Goertz traverse quantitative and qualitative divides to grapple with institutional change. And right now he's also working on a project on explaining political revolutions, Latin America in comparative perspective. Professor Mahoney has been president of the Qualitative and Multi-Method Research section and the Politics and History section, APSA, and chair of the Comparative Historical Sociology section and the Development section of the ASA. He's also been associate chair of political science and chair of sociology at Northwestern. Not yet history, as I understand it. How does Jim cut through all these thickets while remaining such a supportive advisor and mentor to students in so many disciplines and such a mensch? That is actually a question that has long perturbed me. We're excited to hear the talk and discuss it with you afterwards, Jim. Thank you so much for coming.
That nice introduction. It's great to be here and to talk about causal analysis in historical social science. This is a typology by Theda Skocpol and Margaret Somers that they came up with in 1980 of 3 kinds of historical social science. They divided it up into macro causal analysis, the application of a general theory to history, and interpretive analysis. That article from 1980 can still be read today with great profit. The distinctions that they've made are still quite good. Today, I'm going to focus on macro causal analysis, but I don't mean to denigrate the other 2 kinds of historical social science. Application of a general theory is work like Margaret Levy and Robert Bates' analytic narratives, or the Acemoglu and Robinson Barrington Morash book on democracy. And interpretive historical social science is very popular, especially in sociology, in which the goal is not mainly causal analysis. Comparative historical analysis as macrocausal analysis is a field that's concerned with the actual causes of outcomes in particular cases. The actual causes are the past events and processes that produced specific outcomes in particular cases. X caused Y in case Z. And this is what comparative historical researchers are interested in, identifying the actual causes of outcomes. their main goal is not to estimate the average causal effect of a variable within a population of cases. They're doing a different game. With the example of smoking and lung cancer, it's one thing to estimate the average effect of smoking on lung cancer. It's another thing to ask if smoking caused lung cancer in a particular individual. It's that latter question that I'm going to focus on today. To understand if smoking caused cancer in a particular individual, you would ideally, you would want to know a lot about the causes of lung cancer. But you'd also want to look at that case very carefully. Maybe look at overtime x-rays, look inside the case in order to see if you could identify mechanisms. Attending graduate school. I could ask the graduate students here or the professors, what caused you to attend graduate school? Or what caused you to pursue becoming a professor? And you wouldn't look at me and say, that's a non-scientific question, we can't answer that question. You would give me an answer. You would identify certain events, certain happenings in your own past. It would probably be unusual things, things that are not typical, or things that weren't typical to your background that directed you toward graduate school or toward becoming a professor. You probably wouldn't highlight things that are commonly shared by all people, such as I went to high school. I grew up as playing football as a child. It wouldn't be those kinds of things. You'd look for certain unusual things. Economic development and democracy. We've spent a lot of effort. Our very best social scientists have tried to identify the effect of economic development on democracy. We've been at it for over 70 years, and it's still not entirely clear to me, what the finding is, what the appropriate answer to the question is. What is the typical effect of economic development on democracy? When comparative historical researchers looked at economic development and democracy, they're interested in the question of, did economic development or processes of economic development in this particular country cause democracy in that country? And they may end up making arguments like, in India, the absence of economic development was a cause of democracy, even if on average economic development does cause democracy within a large population of cases. This is an article that I want to plug. It's by Mahoney and Acosta, A Regularity Theory of Causality for the Social Sciences. It's the theory of causality that I'll be drawing on today. It's has a long history in philosophy. It's a respected theory of causality. I think it's the theory of causality that's implicitly used by lots of comparative historical researchers. I think it's the theory of causality that's used in books like these. These are all comparative historical books that are, broadly speaking, in the tradition of macro-causal analysis. And I think all of them are asking causal questions, but their goal is not mainly to identify the average effect of some variable in a population of cases. They want to know if certain causes actually cause specific outcomes in particular cases. This slightly angry looking man does anybody know who this is?
God.
What?
God.
No, it is, yes, it's Guillermo O'Donnell. And he's angry because he thinks that a regularity theory of causality is not kind of getting the attention that it deserves in social science. Actually, his most famous theory was the theory of bureaucratic authoritarianism in Latin America. And I want to use him as one of my examples. One of his arguments was that economic growth under the Estado Novo in Brazil was a cause of bureaucratic authoritarianism. And a related argument is that economic growth under populist government after 1930 was a cause of bureaucratic authoritarianism in Brazil Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay. Both of these statements refer to actual causes. The first statement, this one up here, refers to a specific cause that only happened once, the Estado Novo in Brazil. The second statement refers to a more general cause, populist government. Both of those are actual causes. Something can be an actual cause that only happens once and applies to only one case. Something can be an actual cause that's more general and can happen in multiple cases. The point's worth making because sometimes when I talk about actual causes, people think it has to be idiosyncratic to a single case. Of course it doesn't. It can be a general factor that can apply to multiple cases. And so the first distinction I want to make is two types of actual causes, case-specific actual causes and general actual causes. Case-specific actual causes are distinctive to one case. If we say something like the storming of the Bastille was a cause of the French Revolution, that only happens once. But if we say something like an assault on a national prison was a cause of the French Revolution, we've identified a cause that can apply to other cases. Here's a 2x2. It's a situating comparative historical analysis. The first dimension is, are we concerned with causal generalizations? The second dimension is, are we concerned with actual causes? I think comparative historical analysis, at least defined as macrocausal analysis, is that field of research that's interested in actual causes and interested in general causes that apply to more than one case, or at least that can apply to more than one case. And so, whereas certain works of history may talk about actual causes that are unique to specific cases, comparative historical analysts try to identify actual causes that can apply in multiple cases. Here's another fun diagram. Let me go over it kind of slowly. The main dimension here is between case-oriented research and population-oriented research. With case-oriented research at the extreme, you're only interested in one case. With population-oriented research at the extreme, you're only interested in the population and you don't care about any specific case. Over here on the extreme, we have a case study. We can imagine a case study in which the researcher is only interested in explaining the one actual case. And the question of generalization, it's not the goal. The outcome might even be defined as something that only happened once in world history. And your goal is to explain that singular outcome in that case study. Of course, you'll draw on general theories and use general concepts, but you're interested in the one case. Over on the other side, on the extreme of population-oriented research, we have an experiment in which you're not interested in any single case. To do the experiment well, you may want to know as little as possible about each individual case, other than they meet the criteria for inclusion in the population and their values on the treatment and outcome. And at the end of the experiment, you'll have a finding that says something about the population, that says something about the average effect of the treatment within the population. Between those two extremes, there's different kinds of research. Comparative historical analysis here, it's more on this case-oriented side, but as we'll see, it does want to make some generalizations. It does want to talk about general actual causes that apply to more than one case. Next in line, I have what I call small n theory testing with case studies. And a lot of IR work that I see begins with the presentation of a general model or a general theory. And it will then test that theory or evaluate that theory by looking at a small number of case studies. There's countless IR books like this. They begin with a general causal model, and then they evaluate that causal model through a few case studies. to see if those case studies are consistent with the general causal model. Moving on the other side, we have the experiment, and a little bit more to the oriented toward the case side would be if you do a regression experiment, but you also include qualitative observations. For example, you do focus groups and you use insights from particular cases to help you design your questions better or run your experiment better. Or you're doing a regression study and you know a lot about certain cases, and that knowledge of those cases helps you do a better job designing the causal model for the regression. If we continue a little further over, you do your regression and your experiment, you have knowledge of specific cases, you have qualitative observations, and you might even do some case studies. For a long time, like the modal type of multi-method research in comparative politics was somebody would do a regression, then they would have a procedure for selecting certain cases, maybe based on their position, based on their residuals and their position in relationship to the regression line. And then they would analyze those case studies in order to see if the regression results made sense after looking at those specific case studies. There is kind of a line in between these. This research here was still ultimately interested in estimating the average causal effect. It did look at particular case studies, but at the end of the day, the goal was to see if, after looking at those case studies, if the regression results really made sense. If we were more confident after looking at the case studies that in fact the regression results illustrated causal effects rather than spurious relationships. And over here, with these, like these IR books that have a causal model and then a few case studies, I think at the end of the day, a lot of those, they were more interested in the case studies. They were super concerned with getting the cases right. In some ways, you could tell that the causal model had been inductively derived from the cases. And it was presented first as if it was thought up on the hillside, and then the cases were conducted. But in fact, the book is very much about getting the cases right and identifying the actual causes of specific outcomes in those cases. And so this is one way of thinking about social science research based off of this continuum that has case-oriented research on one end and population-oriented research on the other. And I'm going to focus today on research that's here, more on the case-oriented side. This comparative historical analysis work, it can be more focused on an outcome, or it can be more focused on causes. If it's outcome-centered research, the goal is developing some kind of causal model in order to explain an outcome in one or more specific cases. Just as a very simple example, you might say that the combination of A, B, and C caused Y in certain specific cases. And obviously you might have a more elaborate causal model than that, but your goal is to come up with a fairly comprehensive explanation of the outcome in these specific cases. You draw on theory, general concepts, existing findings in order to arrive at your causal model, but you want a fairly totalizing explanation of the outcome in those specific cases. With cause-oriented research, the goal is to understand the effects, if any, of a particular causal factor in one or more specific cases. Here you're starting with the cause, and you want to know, did it have an effect on the outcome in this particular case or in these particular cases? Normally, this leads you, at least implicitly, to explore, was that causal factor X approximately necessary for Y, such that if it hadn't happened or it had happened differently, then Y would not have happened. Or you might end up concluding that this factor X was approximately sufficient for the outcome. In other words, once this cause happened, given the context of the case, the outcome was going to follow in that particular case. Outcome-centered research seeks to specify a set of causes that are approximately jointly sufficient for an outcome. By contrast, cause-oriented research, I think it seeks to specify the extent to which a given causal factor was necessary and was sufficient for an outcome. And what it means to be somewhat necessary or somewhat sufficient for an outcome is something that I work on and other people work on. And hopefully we come up with a fairly rigorous mathematical understanding of what that means. Outcome-centered research. Here's an example. Steve Levitsky and Luke and Way, their book on competitive authoritarianism. At the end of the day, they arrive at, they don't write it out as a Boolean formula, but we can, we can't see the outcome here. It says not W and either O or not L is sufficient for, what was the Y? And if we read the equation in regular words, their argument, their causal model is not high Western linkage and either high organizational power or not Western leverage, or both, is sufficient for stable authoritarianism. And so they have this distinction between Western linkage and Western leverage, and you need Western linkage to get stable authoritarianism, but it's not enough by itself. It has to combine with one or both of two other things. And in the end is what they do. They analyze 35 cases briefly. And at the end, they report that their theory is consistent with outcomes in 28 of those cases. And they say that of the 7 non-matches, 6 of them, they're basically matches. There's just little quirks and things. And one of them is a true outlier. And so that causal package, that causal recipe is not fully sufficient for the outcome, but it's getting close. It works, depending on how you count, you might say it works in 34 out of the 35 cases. And they consider that pretty good. And so that's an example of outcome-centered research in which they're trying to explain the outcome of stable authoritarianism. Cause-centered research, here the analyst focuses on an individual event or process X, some occurrence in some particular case, and asks about the extent to which it was individually necessary and or individually sufficient for outcome Y in that case, or if you're comparative historical research, it would be 2 or more cases. And I think the most prominent comparative historical examples of this are path-dependent explanations in which the researcher purports to identify a critical juncture or a critical event that was hugely consequential for the outcome in that specific case. I want to plug another article. This one is by Mahoney and Garcia Montoya, and it's called Critical Event Analysis and Case Study Research and Sociological Methods in Research. And we have this complicated table too, but it's not as bad as it looks. It has 10 examples of studies. The studies, so many of them focus on more than one case, but I've plucked out one case. It has a critical event, it has an outcome, and here's our assessment based off of the work of the degree to which it was necessary and sufficient for the outcome. So if we go to this first one, Vivek Chibber, one of he's mainly writing a book about India. But one of his cases is South Korea. And he's arguing that the export-led industrialization strategy in South Korea was necessary basically for an enduring developmental state in that case. And it was also moderately sufficient. And that allows him to say that India was missing that cause and therefore didn't have a developmental state. And then he goes into why India was missing that cause. Let's find another one that has more sufficiency than necessity. Let's see. Here we go. This is Rachel Riedel. She's looking at the case of Ghana. Her outcome is the creation of a stable institutionalized party system. She argues that there was a strategy of incorporation in Ghana that was pursued by the Rawlings administration in the early 80s. And her argument is Ghana actually was slightly overdetermined that it was going to get this outcome that she's looking at of a stable institutionalized party system. There were other factors in place that may well have produced that outcome even without her cause. However, once this strategy of incorporation happened, Ghana was on a path such that it was going to end up with that cause. It was extremely likely that it would end up with that cause, even if other things had been different in context. That cause was enough, basically, by itself, within the broader context of Ghana, to lead to the outcome of interest. And so this is what this table is doing, is it's giving us 10 examples of critical events that are either highly necessary or highly sufficient for the outcome, or both. None of them are trivial, because the ones that are highly necessary are also at least moderately sufficient. Trivial necessary cause is a necessary cause that's always present, like gravity's a necessary cause of any of these outcomes. It's trivial because it doesn't have any sufficiency effects. It's present regardless of whether or not the outcome is present. Necessary conditions become more important to the extent that they exert sufficiency effects as well. And there's a similar argument for sufficiency effects. They're trivial if they're not at least moderately necessary. Two kinds of questions, two kinds of counterfactuals. Sufficiency assertions, they have this flavor where the comparative historical researcher says, once cause X happened, Y was destined to occur under normal circumstances. Even if the context had been slightly different, the occurrence of X was going to produce Y. It's like you have a healthy seed, you plant it in good soil, and you water it. There's a certain sense in which that seed, that's sufficient, it's destined to grow the plant. It may not, weird things could happen. But under normal, typical circumstances, planting that seed in that good soil and watering it is enough to trigger a process that's going to lead to that plant growing. That's a sufficiency assertion. When you make a sufficiency assertion, it's good to do counterfactuals. Sufficiency counterfactuals is what they do is they keep the cause X in place, but they make modest changes to context, is that word, and explore if Y still occurs. And so the counterfactuals that you carry out keep your causal factor in place, but you make modest changes to context, and you see if under those counterfactual scenarios, the outcome still happens. And if the outcome still happens, even though you make changes to context, then you have reason to say that that factor was sufficient for the outcome because it wasn't dependent on a weird context or a quirky set of circumstances. Across a wide variety of circumstances, once X happened, Y was going to happen. Now, the necessity assertion, it says, if X did not occur, then Y would not have occurred under the same circumstances. So if we change X, then we change Y. And this is the one we're more familiar with necessity assertions. And here, the counterfactual is we hold context as constant as we can, but we change X itself. Ideally, we find another plausible version of not X that's very similar to X. We hold context exactly the same, and we see if, in fact, Y still occurs. And if even modest changes to X will make Y disappear, then we conclude that X is very necessary for Y. Like a famous example from case study research is the counterfactual that if Al Gore had been elected president rather than Bush, the US would not have gone to war with Iraq. And this counterfactual has been examined by a number of people in IR. And it's a good counterfactual because Gore is so close to Bush. So you find the most plausible version of not X and put it into place. And then it's debated if, in fact, we would have gone to war with Iraq. Harvey finds that we still go to war with Iraq under a Gore presidency. And if we do go to war with Iraq under a Gore presidency, well, then we conclude that Bush wasn't very necessary. Gore wasn't going to go to war. Gore would have gone to war as well. We didn't need Bush. Gore would have been fine. And so these are the kinds of counterfactuals that comparative historical researchers work with. And there's sufficiency counterfactuals and necessity counterfactuals. Causal chains and causal mechanisms. The comparative historical approach is really concerned with making the spatiotemporal linkage between X and Y. And under this approach, X can cause Y only direct or indirect contact with Y. X can directly reach out and touch Y in space and time, or X can come to an end, but then it has to touch some mechanism that then touches another mechanism that touches another mechanism that then touches the outcome. You have to have, there has to be continuous spatiotemporal contact, whether X touches Y itself or it does through these intervening mechanisms. And comparative historical researchers are very interested in figuring out what those mechanisms are, to tracing the spatiotemporal connections over time, finding what that pathway is. And there's a large literature on causal mechanisms and in the issues that arise with this kind of path analysis in individual singular cases. That's really important. I think nowadays the slogan for population researchers might be something like, no strong causal inference without a strong identification strategy. The question you'll get if you make it the claim about causality using observational data will always be, what's your identification strategy? And if you don't have a really strong one, don't be talking about causes. I think in comparative historical research and case study research, the slogan would be no strong causal inference without a strong understanding of mechanisms. Unless you really understand how this factor X went over time and space to reach the outcome, unless you have a deep understanding of that, don't be talking about causality. It's to say that something that happened in 1800 caused something that happened in 1900 without a deep understanding of the connection is it's dubious. I could present, I've kind of made a living as a scholar diagramming people's arguments like this. This is Deborah Lukianas's argument about development, about the creation of democracy in Parliament in England. And her argument is that having a strong monarchy and strong royal power actually was an important cause of democracy in England. And so she says that people that say that England had a weak monarchy and royal power was weak and that caused democracy, they're wrong. Because historically, the monarchy was strong in the ways that she talks about. And then her book is about tracing the complicated pathway through which strong royal power leads to democracy or parliamentary democracy in England. Scope. Comparative historical scholars, they offer scope statements for their explanation. They often limit the explanation. But if you actually look at the comparative historical research, a lot of times they'll have multiple scope statements. And different parts of their explanation will generalize to different degrees. The full explanation might only apply to the cases that are under analysis. And it may not be generalizable. However, core concepts that they use may generalize to lots of cases, and certain core logics might generalize to lots of cases. One of the things I learned from, one of the many things I learned from Theda Skocpol's book, States and Social Revolutions, is how to make your argument about actual causes in a few cases speak to a broad audience. And Skocpol, she has an argument about the causes of revolutions in France, Russia, and China. And she has a scope, and it's a very narrow scope. She says, this argument only applies to countries that were not former colonies, that have this certain kind of agrarian bureaucracy. And so it's a very limited scope. So why does the book attract so much attention? It's partly because she had a theory that was structural. And she said, even though my specific causal argument doesn't generalize, a structural approach does generalize. And if we want to understand the causes of revolutions wherever in any scope, we need to adopt a non-voluntaristic, non-purposive structural approach to theorizing about social revolutions. And that was a very general statement. And so when I wrote my dissertation, it was about the causes of democracy and authoritarianism in 5 Central American countries. And I happened to write it after Central America had left the newspapers and it was back to just being 5 little countries. And I looked at the actual causes of regime outcomes, and it generalized a little bit within Central America, but I needed it to appeal to a wider range of scholars. And my strategy was the words path dependence. Path dependence was just picking up steam as a theoretical framework. And so I said, even though my specific causes don't generalize, the logic of this path-dependent explanation does generalize, and we can use it to understand regimes around the world. And it's a better way of explaining regimes when your goal is to identify actual causes than other approaches. And so I made sure path dependence was in the title, in the first sentence of the book, and in the first sentence of the conclusion. And so for those of you who want to write dissertations or articles and books on actual causes in one or a few cases, there are ways to design the scope so that it is more general than just that one or a few cases. In comparative historical analysis, there's this trade-off that we often sense between how general our argument is and how parsimonious our argument is. Comparative historical researchers are often willing to sacrifice generality in order to have a nice parsimonious explanation that applies to only a small number of cases. And I think the assumption of comparative historical researchers is that, at least for actual causes, leaving aside average causal effects, actual causal analysis, there's heterogeneity is pervasive. And making valid generalizations across a large number of cases about the actual causes of outcomes is really hard. And you very quickly, as you increase the size of the population, will lose parsimony. If you are able to come up with a really nifty parsimonious explanation that applies to lots of cases, kind of like Levitsky way, then you're going to have you've got a great book. Second, valid findings about the actual causes of outcomes in a small number of cases, I think they can be of great importance, provided that the explanation is parsimonious and comprehensible. In comparative historical analysis, we do want our findings to be comprehensible to the broad public, to the educated public. We want our findings to be relevant and invite conversations beyond just the narrow circle of scholars to whom we're immediately talking. Case selection. I'm just covering a bunch of different methodological thoughts here. Case selection, the multi-method literature on case selection, it often assumes that our goal is to estimate the average causal effect of a variable or the average causal effect of variables. And then it says, given that that's your goal, it's really helpful to look at case studies, and here are some strategies for how you should select your cases. And you'll get anything from like Furon and Layton saying, use random selection, to Evan Lieberman has nifty ideas, and Ingo Rolfing has another set of ideas. But all of that is for research in which the final goal is to do a good job of estimating an average causal effect. What about comparative historical research where we're interested in actual causes? Here, I think you can't so neatly separate the issue of case selection from the issue of the research question that you're asking. Think of Deborah Bukayanis's work on royal power and the development of parliamentary democracy in England. Her case is selected by her research question. It's a research question that's about England. And so to ask her, like, why did you select England? It would be, it's a confusing question because the whole purpose of the research was to sort out that historical case. And so I think, or Theda Skocpol, why did you select France, Russia, and China? It's strange to ask that question, given that her goal was to come up with, she thought those three revolutions, she could identify a single causal model that would account for those three revolutions, identify the actual causes of those three revolutions. And so insofar as we think it's legitimate to pursue questions about actual causes, we have to acknowledge that sometimes our research questions will be about specific cases, and that's okay. That's a worthy scientific goal in astronomy or biology or whatever, to ask to develop explanations of specific puzzling outcomes is not regarded as non-scientific or off limits as a set of questions to pursue. Negative cases are important. These are cases that lack the positive outcome of interest. They're contrasting cases. And one rule that comparative historical researchers instinctively follow is you only look at negative cases where the positive outcome of interest was possible. It's crazy to look at negative cases where, for various reasons, the outcome of interest never could have happened. So you want your negative case, your scope of negative cases to include instances where the outcome of interest could happen. And sometimes it's fuzzy, but in general, it's a good practice, to make sure that your negative cases might experience the outcome or could have experienced the outcome. Normally, we select negative cases that share certain contextual similarities to the positive cases, most similar systems designed, to go back to Jaworski and Tooney. And relatedly, we try to find negative cases that feature as many of the causal factors as the positive cases as possible, except maybe missing one. So we try to mimic an experimental-esque kind of design as best one can. And that's really good for testing claims about necessity. Last thing I'll talk about is narrative analysis. The kind of historical social science that I've been thinking about today, people write these narratives. There's long exposition of events and people are doing stuff and things are happening and there's reactions and counter reactions and history is unfolding. So this is a domain of social science in which the final product looks sometimes a lot like history, or at least somewhat like history. You pick up a book like my book on colonialism, and it resembles the work of a historian in some ways. The historians, they never like my work. It's too analytical, and I'm putting history in these different categories, and it's unattractive in various ways, but it does have the narrative mode. And how do we write narratives? What's a good narrative? We don't say as much of this about this as we might. I think in comparative historical analysis, there's deep connections between the aggregate general causes in our models and the specific events and processes that are going on in the cases. And it's hard for me to exactly illustrate this, but I'm going to go back to a diagram that I came up with way back when I was diagramming Skocpol's narrative for state breakdown in France. And that narrative, it only lasts, I guess, from page 55 to page 67. So it's 12, 13 pages long. And what I did was I broke it down into each individual event that she talks about. And her narrative is very causal. So that these individual events are influencing each other, driving each other. And if we were to read through this, it would seem very specific to France, very non-generalizable, very much like what you might find in an interest in history. But in fact, the narrative is incredibly structured because Skocpol has these overarching causal factors of agrarian backwardness, international pressure, and state autonomy. And sometimes she dichotomizes these causal factors as present or absent, but she also has kind of an ordinal understanding of them. And that dichotomous or ordinal understanding of these causal factors is rooted in this narrative. And so her narrative is deeply structured by her more general causal argument. And the gist of the causal argument is state breakdown in France was caused by international pressures. The French were having trouble keeping up with the English. It was caused by agrarian backwardness, in which they couldn't, their agriculture was backward compared to capitalist farms in England. And the monarchy tries to modernize agriculture, but because the landed elite in France hasn't so much political power, they blocked those modernizing reforms. And so France falls behind England. And then jumping in here from a different diagram that I have is peasant revolts from below. So failure to keep up with England, the state's going in financial crisis, and there's peasant revolts from below that produces state breakdown. And I think the explanation is, it's wonderful kind of at a very general level. There's states that are falling under pressure from other states that try to reform, but they're blocked by dominant classes, and peasants for different reasons are carrying out these autonomous revolts in the countryside, and boils over into social revolutions. So it's a magnificent picture of these causal factors working together. And it's very much engaging theoretical debates of the day, having to do with peasant revolts and Marxist theories of the state. But at the same time, it's all grounded in this narrative of very specific particular events to France. And that narrative is made up of events that are situated in quite comprehensive ways in relationship to the more general argument. So that's my kind of overview of the field of comparative historical analysis, and my also hopefully invitation for people to look into both the methodological literature on comparative historical analysis and to pursue the substantive investigation of actual causes in history. Thank you. Sure, I can fill my own desk.
That was really interesting. Thank you very much. Just going back to the sufficiency versus necessity slide. Where? Yep. No, this, yeah. So I was wondering, how do you reconcile that with the classic structure versus agency debate in social science? Thinking about it, so with the French Revolution, there were all these forces creating, structural forces creating the dynamic, and there was Robespierre. Would it have happened without him? With Russia and so forth. And I'm just wondering how you come around that, because it's clear Scotchball's theory is structural. That's one of the strengths of it. She has, as you say, a very clear argument about what's going on in these three cases. But I don't think I just wonder how you think about that. And she's writing to
different ways we could think about it. Ultimately, is what these researchers try to do is they try to come up with a model that does a pretty good job of offering a comprehensive explanation. But the world isn't deterministic, and the social world doesn't follow any, they're not discovering any laws in the way that a physicist is discovering any laws. Is what they're noting is causal regularities or causal patterns in history. And the fact that sometimes weird stuff happens that blows a case off course, and maybe that's because of great men do tremendous things, or there's a natural disaster or what have you, that's fine, because I don't think, at least the comparative historical researchers I know, they're not in any kind of game of trying to identify any law-like regularities. There are, from their perspective, I think they would say there are no laws in the social world. Is what we try to do is use concepts to identify regularities that are intelligible to us, and that speak to ongoing theoretical questions and theoretical debates of the day in the social sciences. And if we do a good job, we end up with, it's fine to have a statement that reads completely deterministically, but they're not proposing that the world works deterministically. The question is, how well does that statement capture actual real cases in the world? And one way you can do that is to say, what percentage of cases in some population does this apply to? Another way that you could do it is for each individual case, you can ask, how well does this model work for that specific individual case? How tightly does the evidence in that case correspond to the concepts in my model? How much do I have to, like fudge the narrative in order to squeeze it to make it fit into this causal model? I think if you work with multiple cases, you find that sometimes the model really works great for some, and it's a little less good fit for others. Yes.
Thank you so much. I'm a historian of late imperial China, and my focus is on state formation and transitions from the early modern to the modern. And watching this presentation, I'm filled with joy. I was trained by a student of Chuck Tilley's, and so this context is what I think about constantly when I'm thinking about cause and effect in the late imperial context. And I felt that your crystallization of some of these problems kind of leads me to the places where I need to be more careful about pinpointing where my interventions are. And then there was one point in your presentation where I lost all hope, which was when you said that the generalizations had to be parsimonious, that was poetic and beautiful, but also comprehensible. And that's my problem. As a China historian, how am I supposed to think through the value of precisely that which is incomprehensible to the model, and how I'm supposed to communicate anything of value that isn't just derivative of all the best known cases?
Well, by comprehensible is all I mean is that you can explain your findings to educated readers, that if you're able to sit down and go carefully with them, you can say things like, in these ways, China is idiosyncratic. And here I'm going to tell you about what those ways are. And they will be able to nod their head, and there will be this thing we call intersubjective understanding. And I make that point because I think comparative historical research very naturally lends itself to public political science, public sociology, and public history, because its arguments can be comprehended by normal people. That it's a domain of social science. Other domains aren't like this, but it's a domain of social science in which we make arguments that are legible to broad audiences. And not all science is like that, but we comparative historical researchers happen to work in an area where it is. And if our arguments are so crazy that we can't explain them to anyone in a reasonably parsimonious way, then I think it's not the end of the story, but I think that's a serious drawback with our work. Yeah.
Can I say what you said back to me to ask? Yes. Doesn't that necessarily imply then that comparative historical facing historical case study work based in a place that is distant from the historical context within which the case studies that comprise the theories that we're working with has been historically rooted, therefore necessarily is further from the possibility of generating genuine, remarkable, and profound theoretical innovations?
No, I mean, I'm not so sure. I think in some ways you have an advantage because, poor Deborah, she had to work on terrain that was so, tilled over so many times that the soil didn't have much left to give, but somehow she got it to grow. But you're working on cases and topics where there's lots of opportunities, I think, to come in and bring novel concepts and novel ideas that people haven't thought of to the fore. And that's what, a lot of what makes the best comparative historical work, the best comparative historical work, is people bring new concepts to bear. when I talk to graduate students about their research and what they're working on, the most common comment I make is, what's a good concept label for that phenomena? And I haven't heard of that. You know, what would you call that? And why would you call it that? And how does that work? And how does it relate to these other two concepts? This is a domain of research where concepts are super important. Yes.
Hi, thanks for this presentation. So I'm like very convinced, you don't have to convince me. But I struggle, I think, with like articulating to others sometimes the value of research like this. Because I think a really common response, and one that I'm curious to see how you would kind of respond to, is like, oh, this is very nice and very interesting, but it's purely descriptive. Like it's just description. It's just description. How do you?
Yeah, my own response to that is, I'm sad that political science has moved to an exclusive definition of causality, that the potential outcomes framework and the causal inference revolution. It's had good effects, but it's also had negative effects. And one negative effect is it's made people think there's only one definition of an understanding of causality, and that it's the right one, and that it's an exclusive one. In fact, if you go to the philosophical literature, there's long traditions of thinking about causality in other ways. The tradition that grows out of the regularity theory is built around ideas of necessity and sufficiency. It's robust and alive and developing in philosophy and in other areas of like engineering, where they do set theoretic analysis. And so I think like the economists and some political scientists kind of have backed themselves into a corner where they've made it super hard to find any causes. When people tell me they've got I've identified a cause, here's the average causal effect, I'm usually, unless it's a really tight experiment that directly tests the question that they want to test, I'm skeptical. And every domain of causal inference that I look at, it's not only democracy and development, it's across the board. We have trouble coming up with any findings. And so we backed ourselves into the corner where we don't have any causes. And that seems crazy because causation is everywhere. I can cause you to think of a yellow mouse just by saying yellow mouse, and I've caused you to think of it. And so causation is everywhere, but it's nowhere in contemporary social science, because we've got too exclusive of an understanding of causation. So let's open the floodgates again and look at other traditions of causality.
I'm a member of the potential outcome mafia. So thank you very much for this. I really learned a lot. I wonder if you could tell me about how comparative historical researchers resolve disputes. So suppose that they look at Scotch-Pole's theory and I disagree about some of those notes. I don't think that is or I don't think that the evidence given licenses an arrow between node 16 and node 17.
Yeah.
Like, how do you find out if you're right or wrong? Like, what evidence could?
A lot of it is actually, a lot of it is descriptive. A lot of the debates boil down to your evidence doesn't conform with the general model that you have. The case of China, for example, in Scotch-Pole's theory, people thought that she got China wrong. That she mischaracterized the concepts that she used to describe China were not describing China. And I think so. A lot of the debates actually turn on, did you
share that criticism?
What? Oh yeah, I do. I think her argument for China is really weird. I could get into it in great depth, but a lot of the debates in comparative historical analysis, we make claims about the specific values of variables, right? We care about, does this case have this particular value on this variable? We care about that. It seems crazy from the perspective of big N research, because what it means is we care about one cell in a gigantic table, but we do, and we fight about that value in that one cell. And if you screwed it up, your whole argument can be in jeopardy. And this is why it's so hard to come up with valid arguments in this field. people think that, oh, you can say whatever you want, but it's just the opposite. When we present our work, the case experts, often, will not buy it. And I remember when I was writing my dissertation, it was on Central America, and I was in San Salvador in the archives, and I learned about the research of Aldo Loria Santiago, this historian, and it falsified my argument. And it was just like, oh my God, and so our arguments do have a house of cards aspect to them, because if we screw up one case, just one value on one variable, the whole thing can come crumbling down. Yes.
Yes, thank you. How often have you seen magnitude or amplitude of causality taken into consideration in your research? I'm thinking, for example, of the last slide about France. It's all arrows that point towards the end result.
Yeah.
There are no loops that feed into each other and amplify. And so I'm wondering if
The loop should be there. My summary is actually it does an injustice to Scotch Bolt, but I kept out some of the loops because it got too messy. In terms of amplitude, though, I think that one of the most interesting things that's happening in this field is people have come up with empirical criteria for talking about the importance of necessary conditions. And so you have a condition that's 100% necessary for an outcome. You have another one that's 100% necessary for an outcome. Empirically, we can say which one is more important. And you can do this with large N analysis very easily. The techniques are described nicely by the late Bear Braulmuller and Gary Goertz in their, I think it's HAPS from like around 2000. But you can also do it with one case. And the way you do it is if two conditions are both necessary for an outcome, the one that's more rare, less frequent, more atypical will be the more important one. The condition that's more typical, more usual, more common will be the less important necessary condition. And so the quest that we're on at times is to figure out conditions that were essential for the outcomes we're trying to explain, but find important ones that were atypical or rare to that context. To go back to the example of why you went to graduate school, a lot of the conditions that you would list would be things that you think were essential for you to have made the decision to go to graduate school, but there would also be atypical things that were like weird happenings, or they were like, you were going down this one road, I'm headed to be a doctor, then whoop, I switch paths because somebody gave an influential lecture or something like that, whatever it is in your story. And so I think the opportunities for being a little bit more explicit and a little bit more upfront about what we mean by cause, what we mean by causal importance is really great. And so that's not a direct answer to your question, but it gets at the idea of adjudicating among the importance of different causes. And there's increasingly good criteria for doing that. Yes.
So I hesitate to ask a question because I had a conflicting commitment and arrived late. Forgive me if this is not a good question to ask. But I've been wrestling for years with the question of causality from two angles. One is that I wonder what our underlying model of reality in the universe is when we speak of causes. Now, if we are talking about systems where a cause leads us directly to a prediction, and that prediction can be verified, I see how causes are useful. But if we talk about macro-historical events, we're never in the same situation again, right? And what does it actually mean to talk about a cause in such a setting? Are we implying that there are multiple versions of history that could exist? If so, are we in a multiverse where every possible version of the state of the world exists? Or is there just one version of history? And if there's just one version of history, which is, if you talk to physicists, one of the more plausible models of the universe, what does it actually mean to talk of causes? Let me tag on maybe another dimension. There are linear systems and there are chaotic systems. In chaotic systems, you can have a very large number of initial conditions that are necessary to achieve a particular outcome. And it's not obvious to me that you can rank them in importance. Now, you just said something very interesting in that things that seem more unusual, rarer, should be given greater
If they're
importance.
necessary, yeah.
If they're necessary. But that sounds more like an aesthetic preference for me rather than something that is easy to
It's not the only
justify.
criterion. We would also, theory matters and normative stuff matters a lot. And so causes can be important for theoretical reasons, that they're related to a theoretical framework that we're interested in. They can be important because of normative reasons. But the thing I'm interested in is empirical criteria, and they can also be important for empirical reasons. And because we can all fight over what's normatively a more interesting cause and so forth, but it's nice to have empirical criteria. Counterfactuals, I think counterfactuals are vital to causal inference in this domain of studying actual causes. I think comparative historical researchers do counterfactuals implicitly all the time. And so I'm one of the people that when I hear things like, we shouldn't do counterfactual thought experiments because they're impossible to test, I don't buy that. I think we wouldn't be able to do things like have juries and courts in the United States if people didn't implicitly do counterfactual analysis all the time. And for some reason, we believe that juries and courts and things can come up with more times than not, hopefully valid conclusions. So what are the counterfactuals though? I leave it up to the individual to decide if they're real or not. The multiple worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics has an infinite number of possible worlds. They're definitely possible worlds in which they're not the actual world that we happen to live in or have lived in, but they're worlds, and we can talk about them, and it's a good thing to talk about those possible worlds. In the same way that it's a good thing to talk about possible future worlds, it's a good thing to talk about counterfactual worlds too, and to do it explicitly, because it helps you understand your causal claims. It helps you say, I think this was sufficient, because once it happened, it didn't matter what these other people did or what happened over in this other country. Once this happened, the outcome was going to happen. And that's the sufficiency counterfactual. You keep X in place, but you imagine possible worlds in which the context is slightly different. And if you're convinced that the outcome is going to happen, even if you tweak the context in various ways, then you can say, then you believe that X had a lot of sufficiency properties. Yes.
This follows up on this directly, I think, which is about the contrasting forms of causal reasoning that you mentioned in the article, causal power and also counterfactuals. I'm more used to thinking of counterfactuals as you were just discussing them, more like a strategy of reasoning that's compatible, you can use with lots of different theories of causality. The causal power theory maybe is different and maybe more directly contradictory to your regularity approach. So I would love to hear more about the differences or contrasts between the regularity and causal power theory and how that relates to comparative historical
There's
analysis.
different ways you can slice and dice the theories of causality. Ned Hall and the philosophers, Helen Beebe and others, they had one of those Oxford handbooks on causation. So if you go to the Oxford handbook on causation, it's not social scientists, it's philosophers who put that together. And they group the theories of causation into three big groups. One is like manipulationist theories. This would be the potential outcomes, interventionist understandings of causation. Another is the regularity theories that I talked about. And the third is the causal power theories. In the causal power theories, the way they work is they assume that entities have efficacious properties that can be activated. And I think it's very true in the natural sciences that this may be how the natural world works, that there's entities out there in the natural world that have causal dispositions and causal powers. And if you tweak them, then you activate those causal powers and things happen in the natural world. But I don't like it for the social sciences. I don't think it's social entities don't work that way. Social entities are, to begin with, dependent on human minds in part. there's stuff that we partly, they certainly depend on our agreement about them. Some democracy is not out there in the world in the same way that an electron or a quark might be out there in the world. And so I don't think it's helpful to talk about democracy as something with natural powers. And so I say, don't be distracted by the causal power theories, because it's a way of making the social world appear like the natural world when it's not. Now, the manipulationist, interventionist, potential outcomes, Rubin Holland, whatever's, that whole world of causality, it's definitely useful, especially to the degree that the stuff we're studying is things like health and medical stuff, where our units of analysis are individuals, and we're talking about stuff that's more out there in the world, independent of our conceptualizations. Then we end up, like the epidemiologists, they've used the potential outcomes framework with great effect and come up with nice findings. They're not in the situation of like the macro social scientists who use this framework with no causes. They have causes. Smoking causes lung cancer. But it's when we get to categories that are less out there in the world and more about us, as much as it is about what's out there, that's when the regularity theory kicks in and is the most appropriate theory of causality, I think. And comparative historical researchers, we're talking about things like state formation and democratization, huge processes that, whatever's out there in the world, these huge processes depend a lot on our conceptualizations in us. And so what should we do? We should look for regularities among them, using this regularity theory of causality, which has lots of bells and whistles in its sophisticated forms. Yes.
Thank you for this talk. It's super fascinating. I'm a student, PhD student from sociology department, and I mainly have a question about the sufficiency and necessity counterfactual. Yeah, so you mentioned that we can keep the context the same, but make a modest change to X and see if Y still happens. Yeah, my question is mainly about the necessity counterfactual. Yep. So we can find in a lot of empirical cases that there could be two periods divided by a turning point. It can be the end of an old policy or the initiation of a new policy, or just the retirement of the predicate. And if this is a big data research, we can use the DID model to identify the causal effects of this turning point. But what if in a single case study or the small n case study, if we make could we continue to make such kind of comparison between two periods, and how could we deal with the tensions between the causal effects of this turning point and the causal effects mechanism of the past dependence?
It's an interesting question. Let me answer it in a couple of ways. The potential outcomes framework, it's kind of the move it makes is to say, with a single case you can't know, and so therefore don't try. Let's move to the average treatment effect. And the comparative historical researchers, let's try. And sometimes it's easy. Sometimes it's easy to know that X was necessary for Y. Green mouse. What are you thinking of? What I said, these words were necessary for that green mouse that you're thinking of. And so it ranges from being a fundamental problem that's impossible to being super easy to obvious and everywhere in between. And so one thing we try to do when we study necessary causes is find the sweet spot in the middle, where we're not saying something obvious, but we're not doing something that's impossible either. And there is that sweet spot in the middle. This is a continuum from very fundamental problem of causal inference to the very easy problem of causal inference. Then when your N is 1, you can look at additional cases, contrasting cases that are similar to your one case, and you'll get a little bit more leverage. But I think a lot of the leverage comes from the counterfactuals. I think you imagine your case with a different X, ideally a plausible X, so that you have like a minimal rewrite counterfactual, and you ask if the outcome still happens. And you see how far you have to push the X to make the outcome disappear. And if a little tweak in X makes the outcome disappear, then you conclude that X wasn't very necessary. But if you keep tweaking X and the outcome keeps standing up, then you conclude that it was very necessary. And so for me, a lot of the leverage for assessing necessity comes from these counterfactual thought experiments that comparative historical researchers do. And you do also use real contrasting cases, of course, and you can use the synthetic, you can build synthetic cases and look at them, and that's interesting too. But I think a lot of the leverage comes from the imaginary possible cases that you think of. Yeah.
Yes, you just, thank you so much. Yeah, when the counterfactuals are so powerful, like I was just thinking like, why do we compare from the first place? You think the actual cases, because I just said this because you also mentioned that, you know, like in historical analysis, this case selection and research question formulation are like not neatly separable. And then it's kind of like personal crisis, but like, why do we compare from the first place? And like, what
I mean, I think interesting things happen when we compare. It's good for concept development. You know, it leads to interesting theories of how causes combine together. It's interesting to know, wow, this same causal process produced this revolution in France and also in Russia. And so it's really interesting to do it, but I don't think it's essential.
Oh.
In my, look, I don't control what gets published in the APSR. But in my ideal world, there would be a spot for really well done case studies to get published in really good journals. I don't think you gain a huge amount of new leverage when you go from 2 to 4 cases or something like that. It's a modest gain in leverage. I do think it often really helps you build interesting concepts and build interesting theories. But in terms of like the leverage that you're gaining for causal inference, moving from 2 cases to 4 cases, that's not what's giving you the leverage. What's giving you the leverage are these counterfactuals and also your use of general theories, and applying those general theories to your one case. Yes.
Thank you so much for this. So it seems that a lot of the impulse behind this presentation is to encourage interdisciplinary work, to get us to talk to each other despite the methodological differences that we have. I was wondering if we can say that when we are looking at, for instance, case studies versus when we are looking at, what was the word you used? Experiments.
Yeah.
When we say, look at a case study of development or an experiment of development, whether development means the same thing in both cases.
Yeah.
And I think relatedly, so it seems to me that a lot of the reason why we engage in cross-disciplinary exchange is because we're interested in the same objects. So we're interested in development, we're interested in democracy, but not necessarily because we have the same methodological approach.
Yeah.
So why, I suppose, what's the argument for causes as being this sort of methodological link between us rather than something else, like say—
It's not the only one. It's not the only one.
Or interpretation.
Interpretation is another one. And I think most historians are interpretive rather than causal. Based off of my reading of Latin America, work on by Latin American historians, I think it's more common from the stuff I've seen to see people who are not really that interested in causes, but they're more interested in interpretation, understanding what processes meant to people in the past, or simply describing in a normatively informed way what occurred. And so lots of history is not mainly about causation, and that's totally fine, but some of it is. And the nice thing about causality is it helps you decide what to talk about. If you have a sharply posed puzzle, why happen here but not here? Something like that. you then have a set of criteria for figuring out what should I say is, what do I talk about? You talk about the important causes. And if you have methods that help you identify the important causes, then they're pointing you for what's important to talk about. You know, and the other thing that in history that allows you to do that is normative stuff, like the critique of power and talking about injustice. Normative criteria can also direct you to figure out what to talk about. And that's great too, and people do that, and they do it in sociology and they do it in history, and to some extent in political theory, to the degree we have empirical political theorists. Not too many anymore. But I think that's an underappreciated strength of causal analysis in comparative historical research, is it tells you what to talk about. And you know, so that you're just not just confronted with an infinite history.
One
Yes.
more?
Please.
Okay. One of the things I try to ask in social or political circumstances, who are your main actors? What are they thinking and why? And how much of an influence does this have in what you're doing, what you're looking at?
It has a huge influence. I think a lot of comparative historical analysis is talking about events, not events in the sense of like historians sometimes use the word event as like a rupture or something like that, but just in the more ordinary sense of an occurrence in the world that has a beginning and an end. And so we talk about events. What are events composed of? They are composed of actors and objects, including the place where they occur, and social rules that structure the actors and the activity. And so to talk about an event, when I think I'm going to talk about this event, I go exactly to this. I say, who's the key actors? What are the key objects, including the geographic space? And what are the relevant social rules and institutions that's patterning the action in that space? And then that helps me. And part of the trick, at least for me, for writing narratives, is to figure out what the relevant events are that I'm going to talk about. And then for each of the events to figure out how I'm going to talk about it by identifying objects, actors, rules. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of the bread and butter of writing a narrative.
Thank you so much.
This was a lot of fun.